Alright, how's it guys? Welcome to our March meetup. It's a good turnout, especially for the first time, so thank you for pulling through. Even though it looked like rain, so thank you very much. Thanks for Zander. It's also his first time. There were a bit of a betting pool going on to see if he could actually come or not. I made 20 bucks. I would just like to thank, we do have some sponsors. Thank you for DigitalOcean that sponsored us some hosting. 4 of you would go away with about 2.5 months worth of startup hosting, which is kind of cool. It's not PHP specific, so don't worry, it's up hosting. So thanks to them. Thanks to Everlytic for the venue and the snacks. This is a very good boardroom. It's got like a projector and everything, so it's quite nice. Thank you for Code Skills, who's sponsoring a 2-hour team training. So we'll decide who the winner is in the end. And JetBrains for a PHP Storm license, so that's quite a good prize. Just some admin around the hackathon and the workshops that we're having in April. We're moving that a week up so we can combine it with the Johannesburg PHP group. Yeah, we're doing a combined workshop on the Friday and the Saturday, but more details will go up about it a bit later. And then we'll do an open source project hackathon on the Saturday, late morning to the afternoon, where we're going to actually build an app for an eye hospital. And all those details will go up a bit later. And I think that is it. So without any further ado, Candice, we'll talk about some domain-driven design.
I do love clapping. I try to start those, those slow claps. I got moved somewhere. Okay. So I have 15 minutes, is that right? Or
yeah.
10 to 15. So this is my safety. Today I'm going to talk about DDD, CQRS, and event sourcing. I'm not going to talk about how you do them, because I have not tried, I won't lie. But I do know conceptually what they are, and maybe if I explain them in a simple way that I understand, then maybe some of you guys will also benefit from that. So about me, I write code, I buy shoes, I eat hamburgers, I drink fabulous wine, and I'm still trying to figure out the meaning of life. I don't know if you can see that guy. Okay. Does anyone know who he is? He's going to be so upset with you guys.
The light's shining right on him.
Okay.
That's exactly work for me.
How's that? That guy. Still no?
Yeah, that's good. I don't know. I'm trying to beard. Take the beard off.
Has anyone heard of the event store? Anyone heard of CQRS?
No.
He came up with CQRS. His name is Greg Young. And last year he did a workshop in South Africa. He's actually Canadian, currently living in Lithuania. And he came out here to do a workshop on DDD, CQRS, and event sourcing. And he also didn't show us how to do it. For 3 days, he just talked about what it was. So DDD it didn't always exist. The concepts always did though. Domain-driven design was just the name that was given by a guy called Eric Evans to basically a bunch of good ideas that he grouped together and said, if you follow these heuristics, you will come up with really good design. So after listening to a few interviews and podcasts of people talking in very complicated words, I've summarized it for myself in this way. Number one, it's understanding the business domain, giving things exactly one name and only one name, and most importantly, making sure that everyone knows that and everyone's talking the same language. I need to breathe. Whew. This talking thing is not easy. And then understanding meaning in different contexts. So if you talk about, for example, an order to the accountant, they're going to think about certain things that have to do with the order. But if you talk to somebody who's in shipping, for example, they're going to talk about different things that have to do with the order. Where is it going versus how do we calculate what the totals were. So the guy that actually found had the most useful way to understand it was this guy, and he took the ideas and the stuff in the book by Eric Evans and he made it practical. His name is Jim Nielsen. He's a Swedish guy, he has a cute accent. And this was really the selling point for me. He saw it as reusing the good habits from OO and putting them into a package. And he said that if you've been doing OO for a while, a lot of the domain-driven design concepts will not be foreign to you. You will have encountered them, they will seem familiar. There's also another guy called Vaughan Vernon who's worth noting. Well, I don't know what he did. Donnie knows, I talked to him afterwards. So the part about understanding the business domain that's really important, the reason why it's important is that model that you describe, and this is an example of one that I did today, that actually becomes your code. So the words that the business people are using are going to be visible in your code as well. You're going to use the same terminology. So I worked on software for, I don't want to say the name of the company, but those people that drive you home when you've had too much to drink, and then one of their mates drives behind you, like in your own car. You know, some of those people, right? And they had basically customers, invoices, and bookings, and various things around those. But what was very cool was that when you said booking, everybody knew what that meant. And when you said customer, everybody knew what that meant. When you said member, everyone knew what that meant. So a customer was actually a collection of members, one or more. And that was this ubiquitous language that you often hear in domain-driven design. Ubiquitous meaning all around us, everywhere. So basically, this leads to collaboration with the people that you are doing the software for, the business people. It's ongoing, and you have to make them almost part of your team as a developer. Then this talks about that ubiquitous language, giving things exactly one name. So referring to something with a different term in the shipping department and a different term in the invoice department is not ubiquitous. That's just not a good idea. So one example of that, I was working on a system for some accounting type people. But anyway, they were calling something a book. And back in our system, we found that it was called a portfolio. It was the same thing. It was the exact same thing. And what I think happened there was probably the people that developed the system decided it was going to be called a book. So that set of users called it a book. But here we had a system on this side that decided it was a portfolio. So two sets of users calling the same thing by two different names. In domain-driven design, we're actually supposed to go the opposite direction. You're supposed to say, this is what the business is calling it, now let the code do that too. Let the system reflect what is in the business. So it speaks to this part here. It's not so much about translations, just use it as it is. The business knows what they're talking about. And then I have suggested this understanding meaning in different contexts is that depending on what you're doing, you will have a different concept in your mind of what this thing is. So when I spoke about this company that did the driving, you'll see that booking is here, here, and also here. And we call these things bounded contexts because the context of a booking, so this has got to do with the actual payment of the people that are doing the driving. This here has to do with the invoicing of the customer, and that has to do with the call center. So to a call center agent, they do care about the person that made the booking in the call center. As far as paying the driver is concerned, it's a non-issue. So why are we bringing all of that stuff into our software? When you're doing payments, deal with the information that's relevant to payments. And when you're doing invoicing, deal with the information that's relevant to invoicing. So DDD talks about these bounded contexts. It's the conditions that give these models meaning. And boundaries are important, otherwise you start to find too many things are mixing together. And according to this guy, you end up with a big ball of mud. So to summarize, those are the three things I think domain-driven design is about. And if you have these things in your mind when you start whatever project you're starting, let that drive out the design of your code. What that looks like may be very different to different people. But what it's not, DDD is not prescriptive. DDD does not tell you how. It is also not a framework, and it's definitely not about distribution, although it lends itself nicely to distributed architectures. And it's not appropriate everywhere, and there are reasons for that. The one that comes to mind is that you're probably going to end up with multiple models of the same thing, just in a different context. So you're going to end up creating a similar thing multiple times, just with a different focus in mind. So there's quite a lot of work there. And I don't know if frameworks have exactly caught up. Maybe Simon can tell us. DDD is also not that. I saw it on Twitter this week, I was horrified. Somebody told me when you feel out of breath during a talk, you must just drink some water. Some hot water.
I use the metric system.
Please explain. What I've read.
Centimeters, not inches.
I don't understand.
Look at the slide you just showed us.
Oh, I can't go back there. My mother might be watching this afterwards.
It's better that you don't.
But I will check it out. I will really check it out. So CQRS, this is command and query responsibility segregation. Another really good OO concept is single responsibility. So I think that looking at commands, the things that do stuff, and queries, the things that get stuff, shouldn't necessarily be in the same place. And that's what this kind of promotes. And more than that, the way that Greg Young describes it is, so there was originally this thing called CQS, which was command query separation, I think. And what they said was, let's create methods on the same object that the one method will go and get and the other one will go and do. So Greg Young is saying, no, different objects. This object has a method that does, this object has a method that gets. And that's really all it is. It's, again, it's not a framework, it's just a pattern. And it's a useful pattern for things like distribution. And this was actually one of the quotes from him in his workshop, which I just love, where he says, it forces a break of the mental retardation, that because the two use the same data, they should also use the same data model. And he's referring to these two. So it also means that the data source that you read from doesn't have to be the same data source that you write to. Imagine that. So here's a picture of what it could look like. And CQRS is really just this part in the front, probably up until here, where you start seeing events. That sort of other stuff being tied into CQRS. But you can see in the picture that this is querying from the database, and this one is going in a different direction to publish and update. So when you have a system that has multiple users, maybe across the world, if you think of Facebook, for example, you can completely separate these things out. And that means that you don't have this back and forwards all the time, whatever locking of databases and stuff like that, it don't have to be a problem. So how they go together is, Greg Young seems to think that DDD probably inspired CQRS to a large extent, because once you start with CQRS, you probably start to see like some of those DDD things are quite emergent. And they don't need to go together, but they do go nicely together, is the main thing. And he says that CQRS is not, its size is not a problem, since we're talking about the metric system. But I think size does count sometimes. When you're talking about DDD, you don't really want to apply DDD on a small system. It's a lot of work, so it's better off that you use it where it's appropriate. And large systems, large complex systems, is where DDD is appropriate. And the CQRS pattern can be applied on its own. And then event sourcing is also something that, I don't know who came up with it, but Greg Young used that to influence his product called the Event Store, is one of the lead architects on that. And that's this completely different idea of state management in your data layer or in your whatever. That when you want to see what is stuff looking like, you think of it as what happened, past tense. something got created, something got updated, something got removed, some product got added. When I play all of these things in order, I get the state. So you could think of an Amazon order. If this guy added something to his cart, he then removed something from his cart. His cart is empty. If all I knew was that the cart was empty, I would have no information about how I got there. And what he used as an example, which I found really interesting, was that Amazon, through collecting this kind of data, discovered that there are a bunch of people who, right before they pay, chuck certain things out of their cart. Now, if all they had stored was the state, right before they pressed pay, they wouldn't know what got thrown out and what the likelihood was of the customer coming back and buying it again. So by playing a series of events in order to get state, you can check the states at any given time. You can check what actually happened to get to this state. And as we know, big data is not a problem anymore, so that's really valuable. So these are the guys that inspired what I've spoken about today. Eric Evans being the guy that did the DVD thing. Greg Young, Udi Dahan, interesting guy. Also really interested in CQRS, and he's behind in-service bus, which is a document thing, publish, subscribe. And then this Jimmy Nielsen guy is awesome, because he wrote the book on actually applying the DDP stuff. And what I think they all have in common is that they deeply understand the principles behind these concepts. They've spotted patterns and they've given things names. And that's it. And now I can breathe again.
Thanks, guys. Grab a beer. Simon's up next.
When it receives a notification from a service from a product or whatever.
Right, cool, thanks guys. So my name is Simon Stewart, and I'm going to give you a slightly different spin on DDD. So just in terms of what I do, so I do a batch of things. I also run a training company, and also run the JavaScript in South Africa conference as well. So for those that are keen to do some JavaScript, we're going to have our conference in the middle of June. I haven't confirmed the date yet, but it's going to be like middle of June. So once you pull the trigger on conference organizing, it's a bit of a insert cool age-appropriate word there. So what the way I'm gonna spin it is, for me, domain-driven design is a bit like Agile and it's a bit like DHTML. which is going to be a bit weird for those that know what DDT is, but I'm going to explain why I think it's like that. So the reason I think it's a bit like Agile is I think that a lot of people jump onto the bandwagon and they become obsessed with the religion that is domain-driven design. So I'm not saying it's not a great thing, but I am saying that if you become obsessed with it and you start role-playing the different authors that I've seen people do, which is a bit odd, I think maybe you've gone a bit far, and maybe you need to kind of come back into the real world of OO. So that's kind of why I think it's a bit like Agile, because Agile's very much about the religion, which I think is a terrible thing. Instead of taking the fundamentals and applying them and actually getting value, people try and adopt every single thing that they read out of a book, and I think that's a really bad idea. And the other reason why I think it's like something like DHTML. Anyone know what DHTML is? So it's the combination of JavaScript and HTML. So that's all it is. It's just at some point, like 15 years ago, they kind of gave it a name, which is a bit dumb. And I remember I actually went for a job interview, and I've always known JavaScript. I mean, you've got to if you run a conference, I guess. And I didn't get the job because I didn't know what DHTML was, but I knew HTML and I used JavaScript, and that wasn't sufficient to actually get the job. Obviously, the guy that was actually interviewing me didn't know what DHTML was either, because otherwise it wouldn't have been that relevant. But anyway, and the reason I think it's like domain-driven design is I think a lot of people have been doing these kind of things for a long time. They just maybe haven't put it under the banner, the kind of party pack of domain-driven design. So that's kind of the angle. And the last bit of the preamble is I honestly believe that what we do as software engineers is actually very simple. I think sometimes it comes down to the number of simple things you have to do at the same time. But as soon as somebody thinks or somebody tries to explain to you that something's really complex and you wouldn't understand, I think that's kind of points at them more than it points at you. That's my opinion. I really think it's maybe just the number of simple things, but there shouldn't be anything that's actually that complex, unless someone's actually doing rocket science. So I actually work with some people that do rocket science, so that question kind of backfired with them. So the agenda after the preamble is to do two things. I'm going to show you a couple of case studies of systems that I've done, and do a bit of a kind of a public post-mortem on things that worked and things that didn't work. And then at the end, I'm going to take all the buzzwords that some of which you've heard from Canvas. There's a whole bunch more that are from these different books that Canvas spoke about, and I'm going to overlay them on these different improvements that I'm kind of suggesting for apps that maybe I didn't do. And I think going that way around, it kind of makes it a bit easier to understand, because these things are very simple. It's just they've been blown out of proportion, in my opinion. And I'm going to stick to that back. So the first one was for a distribution company. A lot of you know who it is, but I'm not going to mention, just because. So it was a pretty sort of easy to understand system. This was about 2003, that sort of time. It was a Windows app. Had a whole bunch of logic in the Windows app, which I'm sure everyone's done if you've done a Windows app. It's just so tempting to put things in the event handler. We had quite a cool kind of router that was distributed on the client machine, which helped us do service calls. So we used .NET remoting, which is kind of like a binary communication type thing, which is quite cool. And on the back end, we had a whole bunch of data objects. So some of the problems with this application, and it was a successful app, and they've been using it for kind of 10 plus years. So it served its purpose. It says me, it doesn't have to maintain it anymore. But some of the issues, it was very chatty over the network, and it was really just a data-driven application, which wasn't what the business was about. The business was not data-driven. They were doing something completely different. It was just the way that we as programmers had translated what they were doing. And it was very much a SQL Server first application. So we designed the tables and the relationships and kind of went from there up. And pretty much what the tables allowed us to do is what we would end up offering to the users, which I'm sure a lot of people have done. but I'm the only one who's actually admitting to it right now. We also had another issue that the developers didn't really get along with the clients as much as they should have. And it's very easy to say it afterwards that it was their fault, because at that point I was one of the bosses of the company, which is cool, so you can kind of blame other people, which is what you do when you reach that level. But it was an issue because it means that the devs weren't kind of in tune with what the customer was talking about, and the devs weren't keen to talk to the customer, and then I had to hear about it from both people, which was a real pain. So that was an issue. We did have testers. We had actual human testers. Anyone actually got human testers as part of their team? Like 1, 2.
That's from the client.
2 million. Plus minus.
Testing production.
Yeah, the users, yes. So we had actual testers, which was quite cool. We had like big test packs and that sort of thing. But the one mistake that I made is I didn't involve the testers enough and early enough. So they were really just kind of going through the test plan as, kind of a rote mechanics, not really getting involved in the business. We also didn't have any kind of eventing system. So the one thing that Candice was talking about is the power that you get from storing the events that happen in a business. Even if you don't do it as your primary data store and you just do it as a secondary thing, the kind of trends that you can pick up from that is pretty cool, as opposed to just getting these snapshots. So whenever you do a report of the database, it's very much a snapshot in time. There's no trend, which is an issue. And trying to pull these things out of audit logs is not cool. And it was also, and that last one is certainly my fault, is it was very much a tech-heavy or tech-focused system. So we had a framework, which is always a bad thing, and I'll kind of get into some of the details of that. But any system that the architect will talk about ad nauseum is normally going to be a failure. That's kind of the way I see it, and I'm seeing it happen over and over with teams. So it's cool to use cool tech, but if you kind of just talk about the cool tech and not about the business value that you offer, that's not going to end well. At least that's, so maybe this one is a slight exception, but not fundamentally different to some of the failures I see. So in terms of the improvement, so we just go back for a sec. So that was very much data-driven, and everything was kind of in one big kind of bunch of code. There was reasonable structure to it, but it was one big thing. If we were to go and make improvements to it, or fundamental improvements, the suggestion is to break up that one big component into a couple of separate subsystems. So if you think about the business, so the business they sell stuff, and they've got purchasing, and they've got hardware, and they've got a whole bunch of other things. And to them, each of those different departments is like a separate department that's got some contract with the company, and they've got some way of communicating with the company, and some sort of events that they kind of email around to let people know. But as far as they're concerned, it's a separate entity. So breaking the big thing into these separate entities, it will kind of match a department, makes a whole bunch of sense, because it means that each of these things can operate by themselves. They don't have to have, the sales department doesn't have to have the purchasing department in order to actually start up in the morning. It doesn't make sense. So they're very much a self-contained thing. So how these things would maybe communicate, one of the examples is to fire some kind of event. So if purchasing receives a new stock of goods, there can be some event that fires into the sales system to notify the sales system that new stocks arrived, and increase your stock quantities, that kind of thing. And it's happening at the moment in businesses like that they'll send emails to each other in order to communicate. So why not have a system that matches the business? And that's kind of what domain-driven design is all about. Definitely looking at some kind of eventing system to track trends. So there was a purchase or a point of sale component as well. So it will be really useful to know, like Candice was mentioning, who puts what in the basket, who takes it out, and when does that actual transaction take place. The big thing for me of barring this breaking up into the different subsystems is moving away from a data-driven system and rather trying to make components that match the business. So for the business, they're not doing CRUD operations on a database, they're doing something completely different. And I'll show you an example on the next slide. And between these different subsystems, so depending on how big they are, it doesn't really matter, but there'd be some kind of firewall, kind of a virtual firewall between them that would prevent them from just talking to each other kind of ad hoc. There'd be some defined contract between them. And it's exactly the same that happens in companies like that. You don't get different people talking to other people as much. You rather get the person who's appointed to be the the kind of emissary for the department to go and send out an email to the other department so they can actually communicate. That's what happens in big corporates, is they don't actually communicate. So I'm giving away my agile consultant secret, is you get customers to communicate and they think you're brilliant. They don't do it, but I mean, they still think you're brilliant. So this code on the left, I couldn't fit it all in one, and as much as I've used it for years and years and years, I never actually know how to use PowerPoint, so at some point I need to learn that. On the left-hand side is kind of the old code, and the right-hand side is the new code. It is C#, but I think it looks like JavaScript. Pretty much, you just put a few more curly braces in, it's about the same. And the one's much better than the other, and I'll let you kind of figure that one out. So on the left-hand side, we have very much a data-driven system. So we fire up an order, which is really just a representation of the table underneath it. We set a bunch of properties. We then hand it off to some kind of data component that's hopefully going to save it. And then we fire off another component that's going to open up, instantiate an order line to represent lines on the order. And it's going to kind of new it up and set some properties and then go and save it. So very much kind of stock standard code you see in a lot of systems. The move that we should have done, that I'm doing in other systems, is on the right-hand side. So the one thing that Candace mentioned around ubiquitous language. So it's kind of a weird concept, and I'm going to get into it a bit later. But the ideal is that you can show the customer your code and they can understand it. So forget about syntax, because that really doesn't mean anything. You want them to be able to read the code with you and say, yeah, that makes sense. That's the business. This makes no sense to any business person at all. Setting properties, they don't understand what you're doing. But if you can structure the code in a way that's actually friendly to the customer, that's part of what they're talking about with ubiquitous language. It's not just the developers and the customers and the testers all saying the same words. That's part of it. But I think the fundamental part is actually being able to open up the system and show the customer some code, and for them to say, yeah, that makes sense. I think that's the target that you need to go for. On the left-hand side, we've got a bunch of properties, but on the right-hand side, we've got kind of more of a method-driven system. And you'll see that in some of the documentation around domain-driven design, that they don't favor properties, they rather favor behavior on objects. So it's kind of a method call passing in a bunch of things. The nice thing about that is it gives us an opportunity here, for instance, when you add the line, to do some kind of validation on it. There's no way here to do validation, really, because you can't do validation on the line quantity setting, because you don't know whether that's done before or after you're setting the product ID. So there's no way to kind of wrap it up in one operation. So the other one, which I mentioned around having some kind of eventing system to actually kind of monitor what's happening in the business, is an extension on that. So on the left-hand side, we've got kind of the old way of doing it. So we set some sort of magic number to the status ID. And again, that doesn't mean anything to the business. They're not going to understand it. And the developers are not going to understand it, like a month into the project either. But if you look at this kind of thing instead, where on the order object, you're going to do a cancel operation, suddenly that makes a bit more sense. Maybe internally it's very similar code when you actually break it down. But looking at properties versus functions, that's kind of what some of the literature is talking about. To me, the right-hand side one makes a lot more sense when you read it. That's just kind of my 2 cents. So the next kind of case study to have a look at was for a document storage company. This was a C# app. It was a web-facing one, which is why IE is there, just for the government. And it was using SQL Server and Mongo. Is anyone using Mongo? Okay. It's like giving yourself a gift to use Mongo. It's fantastic. I don't have shares in the company, but yeah. So how this was structured, again, it was kind of a framework-driven thing, which is normally a bad thing. But this one was actually quite well put together, I think. So it had the web browser, it had a bunch of routing components, and what happened on the server side is based on the call that you were doing, it would know how to route it into the different kind of handler that would handle that operation. So it wasn't so much kind of mapped onto a table, it was more mapped onto, or much closer onto business objects. So things that actually were representative in the business domain, not just something that was in a business object tier, which is always a bad thing. So one of the issues with it is we couldn't scale the different components independently. It was an all or nothing. So we could add multiple servers, but we couldn't scale one component instead of the other one. It was an all or nothing approach. And that's what happens when you've got this kind of really tight coupling between your different parts of your system. Also, domain knowledge was not kind of as high as it should be. It was a rewrite from an old D3 system. So D3 the database, not the cool kind of graphics thing. And that's one of the issues with rewrites, is often it's really just taking the old thing and kind of newing it up a little bit and putting different kind of tech on it. But I do think even if you're rewriting something, that you need to spend time invested in the domain and actually get into it. So some of the improvements, just to kind of take one step back, would be to group these components, again, into these separate subsystems, and to have some really defined way of talking between these subsystems. So you guys understand about subsystems? So it's kind of a really easy concept. Instead of one system, you've got multiple systems. And the benefit of that, presuming they're going to be reasonably isolated from each other, is we could get to a point where we scale up the one instead of the other one. We could potentially be doing some kind of import, or it's the end of the month, there's going to be a lot of load on the system, but there's only going to be load on one component. So you can actually scale up that part of the system. And the cool thing as well is you could potentially take down one part of the system as well. So you'll notice with some websites, now and again, you either can't log in or you can't register new customers. So that's kind of a way of, well, not so much logging in, I guess that's a business issue. But certainly new customers. Now and again, they'll actually stop that operation because maybe the system's taking strain, or there's some issue in the system. So they can pull down one component without bringing down the entire site. And that's quite an important part of systems, whether it's web-facing or not. Extending on what we did with firing off these business commands is to actually kind of link it a bit closer to the events in the business, as opposed to things that we thought should happen. And also looking at better use of the business terms within the team. So I don't think we were far off, but I do think we could have got a bit closer to actually get in line with the customer, with the way the customer was talking. So the next one is a chat app that we're doing for a startup. And this one's using Mongo as a database. You can see a little bit of a trend developing there. And what we've done with this one is we've actually started right from the beginning and gone for these subsystems. So it's a reasonably simple app, but again, we've been able to actually identify subsystems right from the beginning. So every component is a little subsystem. And it means, again, that we can scale up and scale down different parts of the system, which is a really cool thing. And obviously with the whole cloud thing, it's a lot easier to do now than it used to be when you actually had to go and buy servers. Although people are still buying servers, which is a bit odd. So one of the things that we made a conscious decision, but maybe in hindsight we should have done something different, is we've gone for one single data store instead of actually breaking those up. So the nice thing about having separate subsystems is you could potentially have different data stores, which is quite a cool idea. So it does make the configuration a bit more complex and the deployment potentially, but it does give you a whole lot more power as well. So it means you've got these entire self-contained systems that are operating during the business process. The other thing that we didn't do, so for now we're using Heroku to do the hosting. The one thing that we haven't done is we're not checking in our kind of configuration and deployment packages, which is something that we should be doing, and we'll correct that. And this is something that was brought up in Jez Humble's talk at ThoughtWorks a couple of weeks ago, and if anyone was there. So that's kind of one of his concepts, and I think it's a really nice idea. So you actually deploy the entire set of instructions needed to actually deploy the system, as opposed to having to go via someone that understands how to deploy it. So that's something that we'll correct. So going forward, what we'll probably do is we'll probably break it up into different data stores, because the more Mongo you've got, the better, which is quite cool. And also definitely getting to a point where we can deploy our entire configuration pack to actually get it into Heroku. So the last one is a product of ours, which is a database as a service, and no one's actually using this yet, so it's difficult to critique it. So at the moment, for us, it works fantastic. But the way we've done it is we're using Node and Express and Mongo. Again, you can see that happening. Is anyone else using Node in production? Okay, so it's a PHP. That's not a bad thing, but Node's really cool. Okay, so we've kind of structured it a bit different. It's a different kind of system, so it's very much a CRUD system. So we've done some cool kind of automation around that, and we'll show you later. So we don't really have a concept of a domain. And the reason I'm showing this to you is that it's a subtle advert to speak later, but it's also a tie-in with what Candice was saying, that domain-driven design doesn't mean that you have to use it all the time. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of followers of domain-driven design are not actually getting, that you don't have to try and tick all the boxes. I think it's very much a great set of ideas, and you pick and choose the things that make sense. So the next thing to do is looking at some of the cool buzzwords that you hear in domain-driven design. And with domain-driven design, the more you use the buzzwords, the better, because it kind of raises the barrier to entry, everyone else in the team, which is always a great thing if you want to be in the company forever. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it's a little bit cynical, but I mean, that's kind of what you see in company or teams that are pushing DDD. So I'm going to kind of take a couple of these and see how much time we've got and what everyone's appetite is for me using PowerPoint. And we'll see how this relates to the things that I've already spoken about. So I specifically didn't mention all the buzzwords, kind of slipped a couple in, but most of them I didn't, because most of them are things that you're probably familiar with already. So let's take a look. So the one is, blind here. That's what happens. No, it's not focused. My desktop's not that clean. It's only because I only use the far right-hand side of the desktop. So the one thing is, I can't see. Give me 1 sec. It's a little bit unstable. But then again, it is running Windows, so I guess that's fine. So the one thing that I mentioned before was, didn't really mention, but let's kind of slap it in here because it looks cool. So it's really important to make sure that you've got access to domain experts. And domain experts ideally are not the business analyst. So it's great, business analyst, it's fantastic, I'm so happy, but they don't necessarily know the business 100%. They're just kind of fronting the business. You ask them a question, they're either going to make something up or they're going to go and find out. So it's really important to make sure that your team has got access to domain experts. And so often, I work with teams that are doing DDD, as they try to do, and you ask them, when last did you speak to a customer? And they're, oh no, we're developers, you've misunderstood. And I think that's a really bad thing. I really do. As much as we love technology, and I do as well, you need to actually make sure that you speak to the customer. So it sounds like a really obvious thing, but it isn't, because very few people are doing it. So that's what they refer to as domain experts, so people that understand the business. I thought I cut that, so let's do that. So the next one, and this is not necessarily a domain-driven design thing, but it all very much fits into the same idea, is this idea of microservices. Anyone heard microservices? So it's always good to use it more if you know about it, because it kind of raises the barrier, which is cool. So all a microservice is it's this little subsystem that does one thing and one thing well, which is this whole idea of solid and kind of what your function should be doing or what your classes should be doing. So it's just an extension on OO. And the whole idea behind a microservice, again, is it's something that's potentially sitting and listening on a port to some extent, and it's only going to do typically one thing and one thing well. So that's what a microservice is. It's a very, very simple idea. So let's go and take a look at something else. So something that Candice mentioned was this idea of big ball of mud, which someone actually complained because I didn't know what a big ball of mud was. And if he said shitty software, I would have said, oh yeah, I know that. I've written a whole bunch. But apparently because I didn't know what a big ball of mud was, then I was not cool.
So that's fine. Did you get that job?
Sorry. No, I did. Who said that? Thank you very much. So all a big ball of mud is, and the reason I'm mentioning it, because if you read the books and you speak to DDD practitioners, you're going to hear about it because they're going to mention it repeatedly and just kind of nod anyway. But a big ball of mud is just this big chunk of code or this big chunk of components where there's no logical separation between different units of functionality, or kind of different. Imagine, a big company where there are no departments and everyone's just kind of working together, which sounds like the ideal company, which doesn't happen. So imagine like a really bad corporate, and you just take away all the walls and all the departments. Everyone's kind of just running around. So that's kind of what a big ball of mud is. So again, it's something we all know. It just happens to have been dressed up a little bit different. I probably don't have the stomach to go through them all, but let's just kind of go through a couple other ones, the main ones that you'll hear. So I mentioned microservices. And although it's not necessarily, and we can get into kind of the academics about what's different, there's something called a bounded context, which is something that Candice mentioned. And think of a bounded context as a subsystem, because that's what it is. It's a subsystem that contains a bunch of your objects that makes up your business domain. And those things in the bounded context are not going to just be able to communicate with other bounded contexts kind of ad hoc. They're only going to be able to do it via some kind of well-defined contract in order to make sure that that bounded context has got integrity. So bounded context and a microservice to me are very much the same thing. Get into semantics, but I think for me they're the same thing. So that's what bounded context is. So ubiquitous language we spoke about. And for me, the two most important things when it comes to domain-driven design, I really think that the only two things you actually have to worry about. The one is ubiquitous language, so what it fundamentally means, and it's not just using the same nouns as the business, because I think that's just kind of window dressing. I think you've actually got to get to the point that you can walk your customer through your code and for them to actually understand. So fundamentally for the code fundamentally to represent the business. And it's a very difficult thing to do because you can't just rename a few things. The whole behavior and the whole structure of the code needs to actually match the business. But if you think about it, it's kind of for the business that you're making the software. So it may as well match their behavior. It just makes a whole lot of sense. So I don't know how many more I can pick. So the main events for me are just events that happens within the business. So new sales order is an event, and an order cancelled is going to be an event as well. And how you manage and react to that event is obviously specific to your business or kind of the customer's business. So it's not really kind of here's a reference architecture. It's more like just a general concept. A lot of the other ones like value types and entities are obviously very important, but I'm not really going to get into it because for me, fundamentally, the most important things are the bounded context, so the subsystems that you break your system up into, and the idea of ubiquitous language. And pretty much every team that I work with that does DDD is not doing those two correctly. So to start getting into arguments about value types versus entities, which I've heard people do, which is really difficult to listen to. So you've actually got to go on Twitter and just badmouth them from there because you can't actually do it straight on. I'm just turn bad. So forget about it. If your team is at the point that they're arguing about value types versus entities, which you guys can have a read up about, I think you've either done everything perfectly or things are terrible. And it's probably going to be, you know which one it's going to be. So cohesion and coupling you'll hear a fair amount about. You guys comfortable with what cohesion and coupling is? So for me, the simple way of looking at it is coupling is the reliance that one component has got on the other. So if you can't function, if component A can't function because component B is not working properly, then that's a tight coupling between the two components, which is not a great place to be. Obviously, you can have certain components that are tightly coupled, but in general, it should be a bit more of a loose arrangement. And the other one is cohesion, and cohesion for me is relatedness. So are these things related and relevant to be in the same class or the same namespace or the same component or the same system? So for me, that's a very simple way of looking at the two. The one that you'll read up a fair amount about, so Canvas covered event sourcing, which is a really cool concept. But again, just because it's a cool concept doesn't mean that you have to do it. I know of some teams, I'm working with some teams that have gone that route, and it's either working for them or it's not working for them, kind of depending on the team. But I think it's a pretty bold move to do. And as soon as you do that, you're making it very difficult for other people to get into your project, which I don't think should be the objective. There's enough work out there that you don't have to kind of hang on for dear life and kind of use really cool techniques that you read about. So that's event sourcing. The idea of an anemic domain model. So I'm probably going to do another one after this, just in case anyone's reaching the end. So an anemic domain model is something that really doesn't offer any behavior. It's really just a kind of POCO object. I don't know what a POCO object is in PHP. So plain old PHP objects, the POCO. Is it POCO?
Yep.
So POCO is like the police.
Exactly.
So when, I don't know if I can actually say that again, it's really not cool. So if you're just newing up an object and you're setting a bunch of properties, your component is not offering any value. You're just kind of, just putting a bunch of data into a bag object and then presumably sending it to MySQL or something like that. And that's what they refer to as an anemic domain model, because it's not really doing anything. The one on the right, obviously it's a hugely simplified code, but the one on the right is closer to being a richer domain model, because it's not just setting a bunch of properties, it's actually exhibiting some kind of behavior that presumably mimics what the business does. So that's kind of what those two are. So let's pick one more. So this one at the bottom is, so there are a whole bunch of different words for the same thing, because different people were writing blogs and kind of, it was like a salvo into someone else's career, and they were writing blogs and they were like torpedoing other people. It's quite cool. So the idea of hexagonal design and onion architecture and ports and adapters, it's all the same thing. There's a whole lot of semantics you can get into, but fundamentally it's the same thing. And what that's saying is, instead of designing your system where everything's hooked into each other, which is that typical 3-tier architecture, where the front end has to talk to that business object or that business tier, which has to talk to that data tier underneath it, which is then hardwired to talk to MySQL or Postgres or whatever it is that you want to use. Instead of doing that, to rather have a much more of a loose coupling between the components and be able to swap things out. So that's really all they're talking about. The ports and adapters, so it's from not from Windows machines, but it's kind of from any computer where you've got, let's say you're sending a whole bunch of data out of a certain port. So that's kind of your contract. You're sending certain messages out of the port, and it's for some kind of adapter that's going to listen on that port for that specific message that can react to it. So it's about contract between the thing that's sending the message and the thing that can satisfy that message. And the idea is to not actually care about who's actually doing the work, but rather care about making sure that you have a contract between those two parties. And that's really all they're talking about, which is kind of fundamental of O, and it's a part of Solid as well. So really nothing kind of revolutionary. So the CQRS is a cool term, which is what Candice was talking about. And really the fundamentals of it, which is, again, what she said, is that you've taken one component, which used to do the reads and the writes and the updates and deletes, and you're breaking it into two. That's kind of fundamentally what Greg Young's been talking about. And on top of that, you can do a bunch of things, but fundamentally that is what it's about. And the reason for doing that, or for me, the reason for doing that, is that it allows you to start choosing different technologies to satisfy different parts of the system, which is something that you can get to with going the bounded context route or the microservice route, is you can get to the point where your team can decide what is going to be the best way to allow really fast reads out of our system. Forget about what we've been using up until now, what's going to be the best way to do it. As opposed to saying, well, we've got this huge framework we've built and we have to kind of carry on using it, so let's just kind of put another class together or another page together or whatever else it is. So just to kind of go through a couple of slides. So for me, this has been the evolution of design. So I'm not going to go further back than that, but I did go all the way to 2015. So the evolution of design books, I think a lot of it came from the kind of the main design patterns book, which I'm sure very few people have read, which is fine. As long as you reference it in conversation, that's kind of all you need to do. That's the most important thing. Eric Evans' book is from 2003. So I think in general, you can always read up about how wonderful the book is on Amazon because it is a good book to read. But you must also understand that it came out at a point where NoSQL databases were not popular and well used. And it also came out at a point where the whole idea of cloud and spawning up 100 machines to kind of host your microservices were not a possibility. So I'm not saying it's not relevant, but I am saying that you need to view it as happening at a point before the whole cloud explosion happened. And that's a really important thing to remember when you start reading books like that. And Eric Evans has done some talks subsequent to that. And he's certainly not backpedaling, but he is saying that the order in which he was prioritizing things has changed. And I think it's useful to try to get the full picture. And you only get the full picture if you start reading a whole bunch, which unfortunately very few people do. Vaughan Werner's book is also very useful, so it's kind of an extension on top of what Eric Evans has been talking about. For me, if you're going to pick one book, which is probably kind of down to what you're going to pick, my suggestion is to actually read Sam Newman's book, so Building Microservices. It's a much easier book to read, and it's a lot less like a PhD being read by Keanu Reeves, which is kind of what the other ones are like. So it's not specifically an insult, it's just saying it's a different way of looking at it. So I really enjoyed Sam Newman's book. So if you want to pick one book to read, I would go that route. And for me, the important thing is none of those books should be viewed as the sole source of information. And too often, and I've said it a couple of times, too often teams are reading one book or they've gone on one course and they dig their nails in and say, well, that's what we're going to choose. Which is kind of exactly why I created that analogy with Agile at the beginning. So that's kind of the migration of, for me, is the migration of some of the design books. So some of the interesting things, because I actually read Eric Evans' book, which I think is either being silly or kind of sets me apart, kind of one of the two. But I mean, it doesn't really matter. So from the book, that's not purposely in capital, I just couldn't figure out with PowerPoint and the theme to actually make it lowercase. I just couldn't figure it out. So a couple of really interesting things. The programmers are the modelers. So it's not for your business analyst or your architect to put together this great UML diagram and to throw it at the developers. That's not what it's about. It's about the developers being the modelers. And also, the heart of software is its ability to solve domain-related problems for the users. How fundamentally different is that to most computer systems, where it's there to help you add stuff to your LinkedIn profile? For me, that's what most computer systems are about. And you can see it, because then they have to call consultants in to clean up the mess, which I'm not complaining about. I've done the work. So don't separate modeling from programming, which is kind of similar to that previous one. But for me, another important one is this bottom one. When you have the freedom to choose, choose frameworks or parts of frameworks that are harmonious with the style of design you want to use. And for me, that's around the idea of picking and choosing the bits that make sense, and not trying to get some reference architecture and slapping it in and presuming it's going to work, because I really don't think that that's possible. So for me, a checklist around what should be a good architecture, and this is not specific to domain-driven design, because I don't think you have to do DDD in order to have a good architecture. And I also think the opposite is true. If you're doing domain-driven design, even if it's out of the book, I don't think it necessarily guarantees you anything. So just a couple of things. You guys can obviously read that. For me, very important around the anti-patterns. So if you're using this huge framework that you bought or you've made or whatever else it is, that to me is a fundamental failure right in the beginning. And I'll kind of examine it a bit more. Because often what happens is companies will put so much time and effort and money into making a big framework that they won't entertain any ideas about not using it, because they have to recoup that money. And I think that's a really bad thing. And you see it with some of the companies that kind of work with one specific vendor, and they'll fundamentally not want to use any other products because they feel that, well, they've already bought this product, so we have to use it. So I'm not going to mention Microsoft as being the vendor. Another important thing for me is around this idea of polyglot. So polyglot's just a fancy word that means you speak multiple languages, which is not really what I meant. I meant that you can actually write different languages or you can use different languages. And so often I find that programmers are just single language developers, and I don't think that's a good thing at all. I'm not suggesting you have to try and learn everything, because that's also a crazy mistake. But if you only do one language, I think you're limiting your career. You're limiting your ability to actually choose good tech for different problems. So again, don't try to learn everything, but in learning a couple of things really well, I think is very important. And also getting to a point where you've never thrown anything away, I think is a bad idea. And that's where code retreats come in, which you can chat with Candice about. Has anyone been to a code retreat? So for those that haven't, there's one coming up that you can chat with her later. And I think that's a really important thing to go to. So even if you go to one a year, there's no cost, but have a chat with her and just kind of go to the one that's coming up. I think it's a really good thing to do, because it gets you into a place where you're practicing. And so often we don't do that as professionals, which is quite weird. The perfect world, which I'm not in, is to get to a point where every check-in can be a release candidate. So for me, if you're in that position, that's a hugely powerful position to be in. And the last one, which is really in favor of product teams, but I think everyone can try and do that, is to get to a point where you're dog-fooding what you're making. So if you're making a system for company X, if you're not using that system, you're never going to get to a point where you're going to refine it to the point that customers actually want to use it. And so often as solution providers, you write code up to the point that you're told not to, or that someone pays an invoice. And that's where you stop. And I think that's a really bad idea. It's not easy to fix, but I still think it's a bad idea. So warning signs that I hear about a whole bunch. I've worked with a couple of teams that will reference Eric Evans in conversation, which is a bit weird. And nothing against the guy, but he's not in your team. So to say, well, what would Eric Evans say? Or would Eric Evans do this? I don't think he cares either about what you're going to do. So to keep kind of referring back, it's a little bit cultish. So don't do that. And also getting to a point where you buy the same book and you give it to every single developer and say, this is going to be the standard. I think that's a really bad idea as well. Rather look at kind of books that are not really specific. So if you want books around culture and that kind of thing, I've got a whole list I can give you, and by all means, distribute to your teams. But to buy one technical book and to make everyone read it, which again, I see in a couple of teams, I think that's a really bad idea. You're kind of cutting away all the other stuff that you could be learning from, and you're just focusing on one thing, which doesn't make sense. Also, be careful of teams that are using big code generators and big frameworks. And the reason for that, framework equals investment equals vested interest to make you use it. And I don't think that that's a good idea. I really don't. Small code generators that do a couple of cool things and scaffold a bit of the plumbing, that's fine. But if it's trying to do everything, I've never seen that work properly. So call to action is the following. This is kind of me throwing out a couple of ideas. So by all means, read whatever books you're going to read. Most people don't read books, like really. So if you read one book, then that's really cool. It's not something about vampires or anything. Because that's not really a book. And waiting for the DDD movie also, maybe you might find other things if you Google it. There's a really cool website called 12factor.net. For those that haven't read it, it's a really simple read about some of the principles that these guys are defining for their architecture, and I think it's a very useful thing to go through. Also, please don't ever Google anything that ends with best practices. So often teams are doing that, and I don't think it makes sense, because you're going to get great advice from someone whose ideas work great for them or their teams, but they're potentially 10,000 Ks away and in a completely different context to you. So I think that's a potential mistake. Also, this is going to be my next startup, is to get to a point where I can get all the Google hits for anyone searching for reference DDD architecture, because you're going to make like $1 million, because everyone does it, and I think that's a bad idea, because my way of doing things are not necessarily going to work for you. So why on earth look for specifics around my ideas? Which I think is one of the reasons why you don't see people talking about a huge amount of code when they talk about domain-driven design. Because I'm hoping that they understand that their way of doing stuff and their way of modeling certain things are not necessarily going to work for you. That's my naive hope. Sharing knowledge with your team is also something that doesn't happen. It's not me being cynical, it's because I've worked with a bunch of teams and fundamentally it doesn't happen. But also using the bits from domain-driven design that make sense for you. I think that's a very mature decision. Don't use them all. It doesn't matter where they came from, but chances are they're not all going to work for your context. And one of the underpinnings of domain-driven design is it's targeted at really complex systems, which for the most part we're either not doing, or if you look at your whole system, maybe only 10% is complex. The rest is probably admin screens, and you can get away with some kind of CRUD framework. So just to bear in mind. And also, which some teams really hate me saying, and then I actually kind of put on the invoice about that, which I think really irritated them. So customers are not paying for your design patterns, they're paying for good software. So don't think that you've got to check the list, kind of tick the tick box about all the design patterns. Because you can just make up design patterns, which is one of the cool things about it. So the final word from Robert Martin is very well respected in the computer science world, which is cool. He says, architecture is about intent. We have made it about frameworks and details. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't want to read when they've waded through 600 pages of domain-driven design books. And I think that's really important. So it's all about the customer, it's all about the value you can give to the customer, and it's about trying to structure the code and what you've done in a way that matches the business, however that is. Whether it's a very simple couple of tables in Postgres, or it's some cool kind of multi-layered onion architecture type thing, it doesn't matter. That's kind of my parting words. So that's my dog. She's on Twitter, Lassie. It's got like 300 followers. It's more than most brands, which is quite cool. No, I'm not kidding. So has anyone got any questions? Is anyone going to rush out and use every single domain-driven design technique?
I just wanted you to expand on don't Google best practices, because I do that all the time.
Don't Google best practices.
I don't know, an example, I want to store user passwords, but there are a whole bunch of pitfalls around doing that. So I'll Google it and then probably don't store it all those lessons.
So just on that point, so not doing stupid things like plain text, I agree.
Yeah.
But whether you need to go, salts and encrypt this and encrypt your database and then encrypt the hard drive to make sure, it's so dependent on the context. So that's what I'm saying. So just Googling best practices, you're going to get some guy who's done his PhD that's going to say, oh, well, you've got to do it like this, because otherwise, the world's going to end.
Okay.
So you've got to take it in.
Between learning from someone and...
So I'm a big fan of learning from people and copying from people, because it's like an artist, which is cool. But I don't believe in taking what someone else has done and copying it verbatim, because it's not necessarily going to work for me. That's what I mean.
Just as an example of that, I've literally seen systems where it's necessary for reversible encryption of the password. as for example, somebody.
Maybe don't give an example.
No, not the company.
Okay.
But as an example, somebody might have a piece of software or something sitting at a very remote location, and they all of a sudden need to log into their admin, and that computer at the remote location uses that password, and now all of a sudden the only way to figure out what the password is to reset it. Now you Google best practices and all of that, and it says use irreversible encryptions and all of that, and all of a sudden these things doesn't work for that very specific use case. And yeah, so even something as simple as that can sometimes be a problem.
Right, cool. Thank you very much.
I've got a question actually for you.
Shoot.
So you've been doing quite a bit of consultancy, you've seen quite a few clients and what they've been doing.
Mhm.
Who are the people in your opinion, or rather not who, but are there people in South Africa that are getting DDD, securities, those kinds of things really right? Or is it still too, are we not mature enough yet?
No, so I think just on the mature thing, I don't think that we should view ourselves as not being competitive globally. I really don't. I think maybe our price is a bit high. Speaking to I've got a VC friend in the UK, and he believes that fundamentally that we're pricing ourselves out of the market. But that's maybe a separate thing. But in terms of skill, there's no reason that we shouldn't view ourselves as being in line with everyone else. What the hell? We all write systems for big companies, and we all get paid to do it, and we get to use the same, source code on GitHub or Node or whatever package stuff you guys get for PHP. So what the hell? I really don't view that at all. I think if we view ourselves as being second rate, then that's how we're going to be viewed. I'm not even on stage. Anyway. But in terms of who's actually doing domain-driven design right, I think there are lots of teams that are doing bits and pieces that make real good sense for them. But in terms of, is there one team that should be viewed as the reference architecture? I hope not. Because I don't believe that should exist. I really don't. So even like for insurance, different insurance systems are, again, the context is different. The budget is different, and the user base is different, and the tech is different. So I think looking for reference architectures is a bad idea.
That was true. One of the things you said. I think where I was coming from is I think it was Udi saying that most of the implementations he's seen have been wrong, and wrong in terms of we shouldn't have followed that methodology for this project. And there are a bunch of people, I guess, that, as you say, like jump in, dive in, like, great, there's this new thing, let's go do it.
Yeah.
So I'd like to actually.
So there was an interesting article that I read around. We're going to start taping, so I can be honest.
Sure.
So it was an interesting article that was written about Gordon Ramsay,